Hello, I'm going to talk about an open letter to President Biden. Okay, this goes back to the last administration. An open letter to President Biden and members of Congress from scientists. The scientists say it is essential to remove climate harming logging and fossil fuel provisions from reconciliation and infrastructure bills. So this goes back a few years, but the more things change, the more they stay the same. The big picture is that the timber industry is just kind of wreaking havoc on our forests in a way that's not sustainable. It's not even economical. So, but let's see what scientists have to say about that. The context of this is a bill that went through Congress and was signed by the president in 2021, which was the first year of the Biden administration. Let's see what they have to say about it. So this is an open letter to President Biden and members of Congress from scientists. It is essential to remove climate-harming logging and fossil fuel provisions from reconciliation and infrastructure bills. This is signed by about 200 scientists, including my man Chad Hansen, who is, one of the people that I admire most in terms of his ability to explain things plainly and marshal a ton of scientific information in favor of our forests and vis-a-vis the timber industry. So these scientists say everything you see on the right is a quote. The reconciliation bill currently contains $14 billion in new subsidies for logging on federal public lands, more than double existing levels, as well as billions in new logging subsidies on private forest lands. So why are we subsidizing any of this? Why are we subsidizing logging? Well, it's just money laundering. It's what you do when you have the ability to influence Congress and the president, and the result is, you get a lot of money paid for by the taxpayers. So that's what's going on there. The reconciliation bill further proposes nearly $1 billion in new subsidies for forest biomass energy, wood pellet facilities, and mass timber cross-laminating timber under the heading of wood innovation. So they call it wood innovation, but the biomass energy industry, let's talk for a minute about the biomass energy industry. So the idea is that you cut down forests and you turn them into wood pellets, and you ship them to England, Germany, Japan, and you burn them. It's less efficient than coal in terms of the energy per carbon emitted. It's less efficient than coal in terms of the amount of pollution that is generated per unit of energy, but it is labeled renewable, and so we do it anyway. The European Union labels it as renewable, and the United States labels it as clean energy, renewable energy. It's not, but it's that label that that wins the day. So let's talk about logging on additional land. This bill, the infrastructure bill, includes a legislative mandate for 30 million acres of additional logging on federal public lands. So there's an expansion vis-a-vis the previous administration. There's an expansion of logging on federal public lands. Now keep in mind that we, the people, own these public lands. They should be managed for our benefit, at least our financial benefit. But what we're doing is just flooding the market with cheap timber. And as a result, the Forest Service doesn't even make a profit, but they do get the revenue, but the taxpayer subsidizes all this. So the Forest Service gets the revenue, and it's just not a good result. Let's talk about post-fire clear cutting. Now, what is post-fire clear cutting? Post-fire clear cutting is what they do after there's a forest fire and the forest industry feels like they have to go in and do something called salvage logging. Now, salvage is a form of the word save. So salvage logging is when they're saving the snags. The snag is a standing dead tree. They're saving the snags and the down logs for what? They're turning it into timber. They're not saving anything. I could show you information that would verify that the best thing you can do for a forest after it burns, ecologically, the best thing you can do for the forest after it burns is to leave it alone. It will regenerate quickly. In fact, right after a forest burns, it quickly becomes among the most biologically diverse forest of any type. It is comparable in its biological diversity to an old growth forest. So why don't we leave it alone? Ecologically, we would leave it alone, but the timber industry wants to go in and get timber so that they get their way at the expense of our forests, at the expense of wildlife, at the expense of the financial well-being of the people. Further, the infrastructure bill includes $400 million for destructive post-fire clear cutting on public lands and $400 million in new subsidies for forest biomass and wood pellet facilities. Biomass energy is code for burning trees. Wood pellet facilities these wood pellet facilities are being subsidized because whoever owns these facilities is funding political campaigns and getting their way. So it's money laundering. It's a way to take taxpayer dollars and put them in the pockets of your campaign donors. What is biomass energy with carbon capture and storage? So biomass energy is taking trees and turning them into wood pellets and burning them like coal. Carbon capture and storage is when you have these plants that, this is very inefficient, but you have these plants that take carbon out of the air, and through a very inefficient process, they make carbon into these white bricks that they then store for a long time. And those white bricks then become a way of using the carbon in those bricks to get more oil down the road. Meanwhile, what we could be doing is we could be storing a whole lot more carbon if we were smart with regenerative agriculture and with forestry. If we would let our forests grow, then it would absorb carbon. If we would do regenerative agriculture, then carbon could be constantly, year by year, stored in the soils. So that's what we should do. Instead, you just have these massive pork barrel deals. Is logging good for the climate or wildlife? So what do scientists have to say about this? In both bills, logging provisions are promoted as wildfire management and climate solutions. But commercial logging conducted under the guise of thinning and fuel reduction typically removes mature, fire-resistant trees that are needed for forest resilience. So you take mature trees are the least likely to burn. They're the most fire-resistant. But if we wanted the forest to be filled with the trees that are least likely to burn, we would leave the big trees there. Instead, they go in and do something called thinning, which is another word for logging. They take some of the thinned logs and turn them into wood, for building materials, but that they take some of that thinned materials and turn it into biomass energy. So they're making money at every turn, but at the expense of our forests. Does thinning slow wildfires? So the forest industry and the Forest Service want us to think that thinning is going to slow wildfires, but we can show that thinning quite often makes wildfires burn faster, spread faster, burn hotter. So what do the scientists have to say about this? It says, we have watched as one large wildfire after another has swept through tens of thousands of acres where commercial thinning had previously occurred due to extreme fire weather driven by climate change. And in other words, what they're saying is that forests burn hotter because of dry weather, drought, dry weather, and wind. The drought can be a function of climate change, although we could talk about what actually causes climate change. Some people think climate change is all top down, it comes from the sky. Others of us think that climate change is bottom up, it comes from the way we treat the land. But anyway, they're just saying that we have watched as one large wildfire after another has swept through tens of thousands of acres where commercial thinning had previously occurred. So you do the commercial thinning on the promise that it's supposed to reduce wildfires, but then the wildfires sweep through anyway. So promise broken, prediction did not come true. But the important thing from the timber industry standpoint is that you log at every turn. Everything is an excuse to do logging. It says removing trees can alter a forest microclimate and can often increase fire intensity. So what they're talking about here is that if you let the forest grow and you let that canopy grow in, then the rays of the sun can't penetrate to the forest floor. But if you go in and do thinning, the rays of the sun penetrate to the forest floor. Furthermore, if you have that thinning, if you have a thinner forest, then it's less resistant to the wind. So the wind sweeps through and does two things. One, it dries the soil, it dries that layer of organic matter. And also the other thing that thinning does is that when the fire does occur, the wind can come through faster. You're literally fanning the flames. So what they're saying here is that removing trees can alter a forest microclimate and can often increase fire intensity. I would say typically removing trees increases the intensity of the fire. Plus, removing trees removes water because trees have water, because trees have water within them. Trees and plants tend to turn the forest into a sponge so that when the rain comes, the sponge captures the rainfall. And so it's good from an ecological standpoint, from the standpoint of water cycles, from the standpoint of having a forest that is wet and therefore not flammable. It's good to leave the forest intact. But, the logging industry is able to lobby Congress and the president, Congress, both parties, president, both parties, and are able to get their way. So let's go on to the next slide. What happens when we protect forests from logging? So they're going to say, in contrast, forests protected from logging and those with high carbon biomass and carbon storage are more often burned at equal or lower intensities when fires do occur. So carbon biomass simply means the total weight of trees and plants, and also the total weight of the microbiology within the soil. You include insects, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods. Microarthropods just means very small insects and very small arachnids, which are the spider families. Other arthropods include centipedes, millipedes, pillbugs, beetles, all these things. That's what they're talking about, carbon biomass. Carbon biomass is just a fancy way of saying life, living things, the total weight of living things. So you've got biomass, you've got living things, you've got carbon storage. The more biomass you have, the more carbon storage you have, the more the fire is going to burn at equal or lesser intensity. This is the untold story, and this is the story that Congress is not being told. This is the story the public is not being told. We urge Congress to move in the opposite direction by shifting from more logging toward natural climate solutions that store carbon in mature and older forests and allow naturally regenerating forests to continue growing for greater carbon accumulation. So we're urging Congress to resist the logging lobbying industry, and to store that carbon in mature forest. If you get in and you're thinning and you're burning, you're keeping the forest from becoming a mature forest. It says protecting U.S. federal public forest lands from logging would not only reduce direct carbon emissions, but would also increase annual drawdown of atmospheric CO2 by 84 million tons per year. So you've got, if we would protect our federal forests, then you would have a situation where there's less carbon emissions coming from logging, and there's more carbon drawdown from the growing forest. If you let's talk about this just a minute. So if you let the forest grow, then you have carbon going into it, because if you're letting a forest grow, then the plants are growing, the animals are growing, the bacteria are growing, the fungi are growing. All of these carbon storehouses are growing. So carbon is going into the forest, plus water is going into the forest, because if you have more biomass, then you have that water going from the atmosphere, from the streams and rivers into the living things, which not only contain water, but they tend to create the circumstances in which the forest becomes more and more of a sponge. For example, the soil biology, the soil food web, the protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, the 5 groups of living things that tend to constitute the soil food web. They store carbon in the soil, which is really good for the soil. The more carbon you have in the soil, the more spongy it becomes. That's why Walter Yenna calls it a soil carbon sponge. And, so this is what happens if you let the forest become a mature forest. If you let the forest become, heaven forbid, an old growth forest over the course of time, then it becomes a storehouse for carbon. So now, this has been an open letter to President Biden and members of Congress from scientists. It is essential to remove climate-harming logging and fossil fuel provisions from reconciliation and infrastructure bills. It was authored on November 4th, 2021. The bill was passed through Congress and signed into law anyway by the president, but it's a good statement signed by 200 scientists as to what really needs to occur in our forests. And the conclusions I draw are that logging, called thinning, is not good for wildfire prevention, carbon emissions, water, or wildlife. And, the takeaway is that nearly everything we hear from the timber industry and the U.S. Forest Service is misleading. So it's not a pretty picture the way it stands now, but the way that we make change is to get educated. And, it doesn't mean formal education, but become informed, become aware, so that we have much more of a platform. And, you have to be organized and, educate, organize, activate, something like that. But it's a virtuous cycle. The more aware we are, the more we can take inspired action. The more aware we are, the more we can take action that is efficacious. And, learning about life is fun. So let's do that. Thank you for your time, and I'll talk to you later.